Hi, everybody. Curtis Mitch here from the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology, and thanks for tuning in to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today is a beautiful Monday, December 14th, and the reading selection that the Church gives us today that I would like to focus on is the first reading from the book of Numbers, chapter 24, verses 2 to 17, with a few verses skipped in the middle. Now, today's selection of Numbers chapter 24, I think is a very purposeful selection on the part of the church because it fits into our current season of Advent. All right, Numbers 24 gives us, in other words, one of the earliest messianic prophecies in the entirety of sacred Scripture. Now, that might seem surprising to some of you to think about messianic prophecies that appear in the books of Moses, right, in the Pentateuch, in the early part of the Old Testament. Because when we think of messianic prophecy, we often associate that with the great writing prophets of Israel, like Isaiah prophesied the Messiah, Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel and Hosea and the other great writing prophets of the Old Testament. But in point of fact, we have to remember that Moses, who wrote the Pentateuch, was the first and the greatest of Israel's prophets. Okay, and so the beginnings of an announcement from God of a Messiah to come actually has its start here in the book of Genesis, actually, but we find a very important one in today's reading from Numbers chapter 24. Now, if it's surprising to find a messianic prophecy in the Pentateuch, it's even more surprising to find out that in this reading today from Numbers, it's a prophecy that's actually given by a Gentile and not one of the people of Israel. This is not even someone who's in the covenant with God, Israel's covenant with God. This is somebody from outside the covenant family of Israel. This is a Gentile. So that's even more surprising. And what does this Gentile have to say as he peers into the distant future and he tells us about this coming Messiah? How does he describe him? He describes him as a king who will come and whose kingdom will be exalted by God. So let's read the passage and then we'll try to unpack it a little bit so that we can understand what's going on. I begin in Numbers 24, verse 2. And Balaam lifted up his eyes and saw Israel camping, tribe by tribe. And the Spirit of God came upon him, and he took up his discourse and said, The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down, but having his eyes uncovered. How fair are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel, like valleys that stretch afar, like gardens beside a river, like aloes that the Lord has planted, like cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. And then the reading skips to verse 15. And he took up his discourse and said, The oracle of Balaam the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God, and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down and having his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but he is not near. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. All right, so what is going on in this very strange reading of a prophecy delivered by a man who's not an Israelite way back in the Pentateuch? Well, if you want to sort of get the background and get the context of this particular oracle, you have to read Numbers chapter 22, 23, and 24. They sort of all form a unit. And I think it would be helpful to us to kind of establish some of the basics of the context of how this story in Numbers 22 to 24 works. You know, what are some of the the fixed points of reference that we can use to understand what's happening. The first question we might ask is where? Where is this actually taking place? This episode, this prophecy, is being delivered on the plains of Moab. Okay, the plains of Moab are directly east of the Jordan River, right across from the city of Jericho. Right, so you're talking about northeast of the Dead Sea, just outside the land of Israel, on the threshold of the land of Israel. If we ask the question, when does this take place, we find that the Israelites made their way to this final encampment of the wilderness wandering at the end of 40 years. We're talking about Israel who has come out of Egypt. They have spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. And according to Numbers 33, where Moses gives us a travelogue of the 42 different encampments of Israel in the wilderness, this is encampment number 42. This is the final camping spot, if you will, the final place of rest before Israel will cross the Jordan and make their new life in the land of Canaan. So we're at the very end of the wilderness wandering on the plains of Moab, on the threshold of entering into the land of Israel, the land of their inheritance. And who are the people involved in this story? Well, one of them is the king of Moab, whose name is Balak. Moab is just south of where the Israelites are encamped here, and Moab is afraid. He's exceedingly afraid because he sees the strength of Israel, this massive crowd of people moving through the wilderness, moving right along the edge of his own territory and about to enter Canaan, and he's afraid for his own national security. He's afraid that Israel will lick up all the nations around itself as an ox licks up grass in the field. That's the way he describes it. And so how does he deal with this threat, this perceived threat to the Moabites and their kingdom? He decides to hire a sorcerer, a soothsayer of international fame from all the way from Mesopotamia, whose name is Balaam. That's the central character in this story. He's the one who delivers the prophecy. He's a Mesopotamian diviner, as it were. In other words, he is involved he's a practitioner of sorcery and fortune-telling, and all the nations seem to know who he is. And so the king of Moab sends money and a delegation of nobles to go fetch this individual from near the Euphrates River, to bring him into his own land and to put a curse on the people of Israel. How can I weaken this mighty and strong people that just came out of Egypt? I will hire Balaam to curse them, all right, so that I might achieve victory over them, so that they will not be a threat to me. Well, as the story goes, Balaam makes 3 attempts to curse the people of Israel, he being hired by Balak of Moab. And yet, every time he attempts to curse the people of Israel, God actually, who is in total control and sovereign control of the whole situation, God causes him to bless the people of Israel rather than curse them. Because Balaam recognizes that he can only speak what the Lord tells him to speak. And he recognizes that he cannot curse the one whom the Lord has blessed. The Lord has blessed Israel, and so he does not have the power to curse them. Now, after these 3 attempts at cursing them, 3 attempts that failed, Balaam ascends the mountain one last time, this 4th time, and he delivers this eschatological prophecy. He's looking down the corridors of Israel's history, and what does he see? He sees a king. And so that's what we say about Balaam's prophecy, is that Balaam's prophecy is a royal and messianic prophecy. We see that in verse 7, for example, where he's speaking of Israel, he said, "Water shall flow from his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted." Now that's a significant thing, because Israel does not have a king at this point in its history, right? This is something that is being foretold. This prophecy is actually uttered about 400 years before the founding of a monarchy and kingship in Israel. and yet he sees it from afar. Balaam does. We also see it in verse 17, where he says, he's speaking again of Israel as a nation, but then he focuses in on one particular mysterious, unnamed individual, where he says in verse 17, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but he is not close. All right? So this is something that's will take place in the distant future. A star shall come forth out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. So Balaam describes this king, this coming king, as a rising star and as a scepter, a symbol, an emblem of royal dominion over the people of God, but also over other nations. Because if we were to read this passage just a few verses beyond what the church selects for us today, we would see that there are three nations in particular, the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Amalekites, who are overthrown when this king comes to the throne in Israel. He gives God's people victory over their enemies. Now, a lot of scholars, and rightly so, will say that what Balaam is foreseeing here is the rise of the Davidic monarchy in Israel. You remember King David, the first real king of Israel, right, who was blessed by God and who created a mighty kingdom that extended beyond the 12 tribes and actually subdued some of the neighboring nations around the land of Israel. And it's no accident that of the people that David subdued and subjected to his own kingship, according to 2 Samuel chapter 8, is the Moabites, the Edomites, and the Amalekites. And so this prophecy is often read as a fore-indication of the rise of the Davidic monarchy, of David and his power. But it's not exclusively David. It's not restricted to David. It's something that opens up beyond the horizons of David. It's something that has a greater and fuller fulfillment in the Messianic future. Okay? That's the way Christians have always read this text. It's about David, and it's about the rise of David's kingdom, but that's just sort of like the stepping stone. That's the foundation to the greatest of all kings, of a king who is greater than David himself and whose kingdom is greater than David's small empire in one corner of the ancient Middle East. In fact, that's not just a Christian understanding of this passage. That's an ancient Jewish understanding of this passage. If you were to read, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's one of the scrolls called the Temple Scroll, where this passage from Numbers 24 is quoted, and then it's applied. It's interpreted with reference to the Lord's Mashiach, his Messiah, or his anointed one, right? The king who comes from David's line, but who is greater even than David himself. So this is not even just a Christian way of reading this passage. This is the ancient way of Jewish and Christian patrimony of reading this passage. Now, Numbers 24, though it is oftentimes quoted by the church fathers as a messianic prophecy, a distinct messianic prophecy, it's actually not quoted directly in the New Testament. But even though it's not quoted in the New Testament by the apostles, it does seem to play an important role in the New Testament. In particular, it appears to hover in the background of the story of Jesus' infancy, his infancy and birth, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2. In Matthew 2, we read the story of the Magi, which I'm sure you're already familiar with. The story of these Gentiles who come from the distant east because they see a star, and they realize that this is a sign that a king is to be born in Israel. Well, you see how that's obviously, apparently indebted to this prophecy in Numbers 24. That you have, just as Balaam was a Gentile and not an Israelite or a Jew. He was a Gentile who came from the east, right? He was living near the Euphrates River. He has a vision of a star, and this star is a sign that a king will rise in Israel. All right? You see this whole thing sort of replicated in the story of the Magi. And I think the reason why this particular passage not only informs the story or hovers in the background of the story of the Magi who come to Jerusalem looking for the newborn king of the Jews, it also helps us to understand why Herod was so threatened by the birth of this new king. And the reason why is because of what we said just a few moments ago, that when this star rises and this scepter arrives in Israel, it will mean the downfall of other kingdoms, in particular the kingdom of Moab, the kingdom of Edom, and the kingdom of Amalek. In verse 18 of Numbers 24, we read, for example, that Edom shall be dispossessed. Why would that be significant? Because if you know anything about Herod the Great, if you know anything about his genealogical background, Herod the Great is an Idumean. An Idumean is a descendant of the Edomites, with a little bit of Nabatean blood mixed in there as well. But the fact that this king arises in Israel represents not just good news for the people of Israel, it's also sobering news for the neighboring nations and the kingdoms such as Edom. Okay, and so Herod the Great, who is an Edomite, is indeed and rightfully threatened that this star would rise out of Israel, that these Gentiles would come from the distant east, because his own kingdom, is hanging in the balance. He realizes that this could mean his days are numbered, and that he, being an Edomite, would be dispossessed of his own royal rule over the people of God. So that's kind of an interesting part of the background to where it's not quoted in the New Testament, but I think that it exerts a real influence upon at least one of the stories in the New Testament that's related to the story of Christmas, right? Which we're leading up to here in Advent. So Numbers 24 is important, and the church selects it for our reading and meditation today because this is a text of the Old Testament that tells us about the Lord Jesus himself. Okay, this was spoken more than 1,000 years before his advent in history, before he came as an infant in Bethlehem. And yet it tells us that when he comes, he will come as a king that rises in Israel. He will come with a kingdom that God exalts, and he will give God's people victory over all their enemies. I hope this reflection was of some benefit to you. I pray that God blesses you and your family and your day, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks again.